47 degrees below zero, that was the actual air temperature at Des Moines, Iowa, on the morning of the 7th of January 1886, recorded on a glass thermometer nailed to a post office wall. At that temperature, cast iron gets brittle. A full bucket of water thrown in the air comes down as dry snow before it hits the ground. Bare skin exposed to open air suffers frostbite in under 4 minutes. Livestock that had been standing against barn walls the evening before were found frozen in place by morning, still standing, coats caked in ice, stiff as carved stone. That storm killed at least 20 people in Iowa alone over a 2-hour span. Historians recorded it as the state's deadliest blizzard up to that point. The settlers who survived it remembered it the rest of their lives, the way people remember the year a war started or a town burned down. And somewhere west of Adair County that January, in a small claim house on 160 acres of Iowa prairie, a woman named Clara Bauer woke to that temperature, put her hand against her interior wall, and felt it warm to the touch. Not because she had a fire blazing. She had a single cast-iron box stove, banked low for the night, burning maybe half a cord every 3 days. Not because the cabin was new or well-fitted, it had been her husband's project, and he had died in October of a fever that went to his lungs, 6 weeks before the first hard freeze. The wall was warm because of what was packed inside it. What she had done to survive that winter was something her neighbors called wasteful, then absurd, then outright foolish when she started doing it. One of them, a man named Hollis Crane, who ran cattle on the adjacent section and had been watching her claim with the patient interest of someone who expected to buy it cheap in the spring, had stood in her dooryard, previous September, and said she was throwing good money after bad on something even a child would know wouldn't work. He was wrong. But understanding why he was wrong requires understanding something about how heat moves through walls and why a dried corn husk does something that a 2-inch pine board simply cannot. This is the story of the winter of 1886, a dead man's unfinished cabin, a woman who was given 12 hours before the temperature crashed, and what she built into those walls that changed everything. John Bauer had filed his Homestead Act claim in the spring of 1882. He was 34 years old, German-born, arrived in Iowa from Ohio, where his family had worked a farm for a decade. He and Clara had been married 4 years. They had one daughter, a girl named Hannah, 7 years old by the winter this story takes place. The 160 acres John claimed sat on a gentle rise about 14 miles west of Greenfield, Iowa, in the southwestern part of the state. Good corn country, decent grass. A creek ran along the north edge of the property that never quite dried up, which was something people noticed and valued. The previous owner had given up after 2 years and moved on to Kansas, leaving behind a rough timber frame structure, single room, 16 by 20 feet, with a sleeping loft that John decided was worth saving. He spent the summer of 1882 re-chinking the walls and laying a stone floor. By 1885, they had 60 acres broken and planted, a small corn crib, a 2-stall barn, 2 draft horses, 4 milk cows, 30 laying hens, and a root cellar dug into the hillside behind the house. A good claim, by most measures, not rich, but solid. 3 years of prove-up work, and they were building towards something. Then, in late August of 1885, John began coughing. The way people coughed back then, Clara would later say in a letter to her sister, not like a cold, but like something deeper, something that didn't get better with rest. By October, he was thin in a way that frightened her. By the 1st of November, he was confined to the bed in the loft. On the 14th of November, 1885, he died. He was 37 years old. Clara was 31. Hannah had just turned 7. They had $11 in a tin box under the floorboards, 60 acres of standing corn that still needed harvesting, 4 cows that needed milking twice a day regardless of weather or grief, and a cabin whose walls. Clara had begun to notice now that the cold was settling in, leaked cold air through a dozen places. Places she hadn't noticed before because John had managed the fires and she had managed the kitchen, and neither of them had stood at the far end of the room on a still, cold night and pressed a palm flat against the wall, planking to feel what was happening. What was happening was this. The timber frame walls John had re-chinkered in 1882 had dried and shifted. Gaps had opened at the joints. The interior wall boards were single-thickness pine, 1.5 inches at most, with nothing between them and the exterior boards, but 3 inches of empty air space. On a night when the temperature outside fell to 10 below zero, that airspace filled with cold. The interior wall boards were cold to the touch. A candle held near the floor sill flickered because cold air was moving in at the base of the wall. By mid-November, they were going through wood faster than Clara had expected. The hired man from the next farm over, a Swede named Eric Lindqvist, who had worked for John on a crop share arrangement, helped her get the corn harvested through December. But she could see what the winter was going to cost in fuel before it even got serious, and she had only cut and split so much wood before John got sick. This is the moment the story actually starts, not with some grand plan, but with a woman standing in a cold room in November, running the arithmetic in her head and concluding that the number didn't work. She had been shelling the remaining field corn for weeks. The harvest from 60 acres of Iowa prairie corn went something like this, maybe 700 bushels of grain, which she would sell in the spring. And with every bushel she shelled came the husks. Dried prairie corn husks the leafy sheaths that wrap each ear. Long and papery, faintly sweet-smelling even after they'd dried. They curled and crinkled as they dried, twisting and crimping in ways that created tiny ridges and pockets in the material. Clara had been burning some of them in the stove they caught quickly and burned hot but short, useful for morning starts. The rest she was piling outside. Here is what she noticed. The corn crib, a slatted wood structure, filled to the peak with ears of corn, was warmer inside than the cabin. Not dramatically, but noticeably. When she went out to get corn for the animals, the crib held the overnight temperature better. The corn itself retained heat from the previous day's sun. She had reached into the pile of husks one morning and felt that the interior of the pile was warmer than the outside air, by 15 or 20 degrees at least. She didn't call it insulation. That word wasn't widely used in that sense yet. She had no formal education in building science. What she had was a problem. Cold walls, bleeding heat out of a cabin. She needed to keep warm on a fuel budget that was already tight, and a resource sitting outside in a pile that appeared to hold warmth better than open air did. The cabin walls had a gap between the outer and inner boards 3 inches in most places, where the original builder had run horizontal furring strips. She began stuffing husks into this space from above, working through small gaps at the top of the wall where boards met rafters. She worked systematically, moving along each wall, pushing husks down with a broom handle until she couldn't push any more. It took 4 days to do the full perimeter of the cabin. She went through the majority of the season's husks. Hannah helped, patiently feeding fistfuls through the gaps overhead. The pile outside shrank to almost nothing. The walls, when she finished, and patched the gaps at the top, changed in a way she felt within the first night. The draft at the floor level dropped. The candle near the sill stopped flickering. The interior wall boards were no longer cold to the touch. They held something closer to room temperature. She used noticeably less wood that week. Now here's what was actually happening inside those walls, and why it worked. Air, on its own, is an excellent insulator. Still air has a thermal conductivity of roughly 0.025 watts per meter-kelvin, one of the lowest values of any common substance. The problem with an empty airspace in a wall cavity is that the air doesn't stay still. When one surface is cold and the other is warm, air near the cold surface chills, grows denser, and sinks. Air near the warm surface heats, lightens, and rises. A convection loop develops inside the cavity, the same principle as a radiator heating a room, except in this case it's actively draining warmth from the house. An empty wall cavity, counterintuitively, conducts heat faster than a wall stuffed with fibrous material. When Clara filled those cavities with corn husk, she broke that convection loop entirely. The husks dried, curled, crinkled into irregular shapes, divided the 3-inch cavity into thousands of small, enclosed air pockets. The air in each pocket was too restricted to circulate. It sat still. Still, air can barely move heat at all, because the only mechanism left is molecular conduction atoms vibrating and passing energy to their neighbours, and air is bad at that. Modern laboratory testing has confirmed what Clara's stove consumption was telling her in 1885. Researchers at Naresuan University in Thailand measured the thermal conductivity of loose cornhusk fibre at 0.038 to 0.04, 7 watts per meter-kelvin, roughly equivalent to cellulose blown in. Insulation, and substantially better than dry straw or sawdust. 3 inches of packed corn husk in a wall cavity yields an R value somewhere between R9 and R11. That's the equivalent of adding a layer of modern fiberglass bats to a wall that previously had nothing. Clara's neighbouring farmers, the ones who would later laugh at what they saw, used the same single-thickness pine board construction. Their wall cavities were empty. On a night of minus 30 degrees Fahrenheit, the temperature differential between inside and outside was around 65 degrees. Through an empty cavity wall, that difference drives enormous heat loss. Through a cavity stuffed with corn husk, the rate of loss drops by a factor of 4 or 5. She was burning less wood because the house was losing heat more slowly. That was the whole equation. There's a detail about corn husks specifically that matters here, and it's worth taking a moment because it separates husk from loose straw in ways that aren't obvious. When a corn husk dries, it doesn't collapse flat. The fibres in the husk have directional grain, and as moisture leaves, the husk curls across its width and crimps along its length. A single dried husk becomes a loosely scrolled, irregular shape, more like a crumpled leaf than a flat board. Pack a dozen of them together and they nest into each other imperfectly, creating a matrix of overlapping surfaces and enclosed pockets. Loose straw, by comparison, tends to pack tighter. The cylindrical stems stack more predictably and leave fewer irregular air spaces. When straw is compressed under its own weight in a wall cavity, it can settle into a fairly dense mass over time. Husks settle too, but their irregular curl means they never compact as tightly, and even a compressed mass of husks retains more air pockets per cubic inch than straw does. There is also a moisture question. Straw is a hollow tube, and the cell structure of the stem holds water readily, which is both its strength as a thatching material and its weakness as wall fill, since wet straw loses most of its insulating value and can mould if the cavity doesn't breathe. Husk fibre has a denser cell structure. Researchers found in 2023 that corn husk insulation's thermal properties were not significantly influenced by moisture content compared to straw. For a prairie climate where humidity varied widely between January and April, that mattered. Clara had chosen, without knowing the technical reasons, a better fill material than the straw her neighbours might have chosen. Hollis Crane came by in late November. Crane was 41, a rancher who ran about 60 head of cattle on the section east of Clara's claim, and another 60 on leased grass to the north. His wife had died 2 years earlier, and he had 2 hired men who did most of the actual work. He had been John's neighbour, but not a friend, the kind of man who is friendly in a measuring sort of way, always seeming to calculate what a conversation was worth before he started it. He had heard from Eric Lindquist that Clara was doing something with the cabin walls and rode over to see. Clara was outside, patching the last of the gaps at the roofline where she'd fed the husks through. She had a flour sack of mud mixed with prairie grass fibre, a basic chinking mix, and was working it into the top board gap from a ladder. Crane sat his horse and looked at the cabin for a while, then said that was cornhusk she'd put in those walls. Clara confirmed it. He said he didn't see how cornhusk was going to do what she seemed to think it was going to do. He had insulated cattle barns with more substance than that. He said a barn wall needed weight to hold heat. He had used packed earth or clay straw daub, both of which were dense enough to actually slow the cold down. Cornhusk was practically nothing. Paper was practically nothing. You couldn't stop a Dakota-style cold front with something you could crumple up in your hand. Clara said she hadn't claimed to stop a Dakota cold front. She said she had a different problem. A wall cavity that was making the house colder instead of helping it, and a fuel supply that wouldn't last the winter as things stood. She was solving that problem. Crane rode off saying it was her wood to waste, but here is the thing about his argument that made it credible and worth taking seriously. He wasn't entirely wrong about the physics. Dense materials do hold and release heat in ways that fibrous materials don't. A thick clay wall has thermal mass. It absorbs heat slowly during the day and releases it slowly at night, evening out temperature swings. His barns were cold storage architecture, designed to moderate temperature through mass. Clara's problem wasn't a lack of thermal mass. She had a stone floor, a cast iron stove, and a good chimney. The problem was that the heat the stove put into the room was leaking out through the walls faster than the stove could produce it. Thermal mass doesn't help with that. What stops heat from leaking through walls is insulation specifically, resistance to conduction, and for that, still air wins every time, regardless of whether a man can crumple it in his hand. Crane was thinking about a different problem. Clara was solving the actual one. Word of the Cornhusk walls got around. Eric Lindqvist told people, the way people in small settlements tell things, without malice but without discretion either. By early December, when Clara drove into Greenfield for supplies, 2 women at the dry goods store asked her about it, in a tone that suggested they'd been discussing it before she arrived. One of them said it sounded like something a person did when they'd run out of proper options. The other said nothing, which was worse. The man at the feed mill, a heavy-set Czech named Václav Pohorny, who had known John slightly through the grain cooperative, stopped Clara on her way out and told her directly that he'd heard what she was doing and thought she ought to know that what she needed was more wood, not a wall full of garbage. His word was garbage. He said he'd let her charge a cord of hickory against spring grain sales if she wanted, because he didn't think a widow with a child should freeze because of a foolish idea. Clara thanked him and said she'd bear it in mind. She drove back 14 miles on a December afternoon with the temperature at 16 degrees, the wagon loaded with cornmeal, salt pork, dried beans, and 50 pounds of oats. And when she got home and Hannah helped her unload and they got inside and took off their coats, the cabin was still holding 58 degrees from a banked fire that had been burning low for 6 hours. She fed the stove. They ate. She didn't tell Hannah what Václav Pohorny had said, but she thought about it all evening, and what she thought about was that the arithmetic still worked, and nobody else's opinion changed that. The winter of 1,885-86 inches Iowa was not the worst winter on record, but it was serious. December brought temperatures dropping to -12. January opened with a cold snap that went to -22 by the 3rd week. And then, on the morning of January 6th, 1,886, the sky turned the particular shade of grey-green that prairie people learn to read, a bruised, flat colour that comes from a specific combination of moisture and Arctic air colliding at altitude. Clara had seen that sky before. The sky looked like January 7th was going to arrive with something worse than what had been happening so far, and she had 12 hours to act on that. She knew it not because anyone told her, but because she looked at the sky at 8 in the morning, looked at her thermometer at noon when it read -14, looked at the direction the wind had shifted overnight, now coming hard from the northwest, the coldest quarter, and concluded that by nightfall they were going to be in something serious. The fire was going. The woodpile was stacked against the north side of the cabin, close enough to reach without crossing open yard in a whiteout. The root cellar was checked, and the door was braced with a timber wedge so it wouldn't freeze shut. Hannah was inside. What Clara did with those 12 hours was add the last available layer of protection to the cabin floor. The stone floor was cold. Not as cold as an uninsulated floor would have been. The stone held daytime heat better than bare wood, but the chill radiated upward, especially at night, especially in the corners where cold air pooled. Hannah slept in the loft, which was warmer, but Clara slept near the stove because she had to keep it fed through the night, and the floor drafts came to her even when the walls held. She had saved several burlap sacks filled with loose husks, more than she needed for the walls. She spread them across the floor in double layers, overlapping the edges so no gap sat between bags. Then she put the braided rag rugs she had over them. The rug over the husk bags over the stone floor was 6 inches of layered insulation between the ground and the air in the room. She was building, without naming it, a system that modern building scientists call a thermal break, an interruption of the pathway between cold material and warm room. Stone is an excellent conductor of heat. A person standing on bare stone on a -40 night loses heat to the floor nearly as fast as they lose it to cold air. Put 6 inches of still air insulation between them and the stone, and that pathway is effectively cut. By 3 in the afternoon, the sky had gone flat white. By 6, the temperature was at -28 and falling. By 9 that evening, it was at -39. The big freeze of January 1886. That's what Iowa newspapers called it after the fact. Produced recorded temperatures of -47 degrees Fahrenheit at Des Moines and -43 at Council Bluffs over a 7-2-hour period. Somewhere in the middle of the state, the pattern is consistent. Temperatures in the -30 to -42 range at the coldest hours, accompanied by a northwest wind that had been running since before midnight. That wind is what makes the number worse than it looks on paper. At -40 degrees with a 25-mile-per-hour wind, the wind chill equivalent is around -70. Human skin exposed to -70 wind chill freezes in under 2 minutes. Wet skin freezes in seconds. Any gap in clothing becomes immediately dangerous. Any unprotected structure, a thin-walled chicken coop, a barn with a broken door, a root cellar with a badly fitted lid, bleeds heat at a rate that will kill everything inside it before morning. 3 people in Adair County died in that freeze. A man found in his barn, apparently disoriented in zero visibility, trying to find his way back to the house after going out to check on animals after dark. An elderly woman whose chimney threw sparks onto a dry wood roof and started a fire that left her outside in the cold before neighbours could reach her. A child of 4 who was never adequately explained in the county records. Hollis Crane lost 8 cattle. They were in his biggest barn, which he had been building a second structure around a project he hadn't finished, and the uninsulated outer wall failed to keep enough warmth for the animals inside. 8 head. At roughly $20 apiece, in 1886 dollars, was $160 gone in a single night. Clara's 4 cows were alive in the morning. Her barn was not insulated, but it was small 2 stalls, low ceiling, the cows themselves generating body heat, and she had packed it with all available dry corn stalks and straw around the animals before the storm hit. 4 large bodies in an enclosed space generate somewhere between 1,500 and 3,000 British thermal units per hour, collectively. In a small, tight space, that's meaningful. Her barn held, inside the cabin, at the coldest hour which Clara noted in a brief journal entry as The stars gone, the wind shaking the north wall, the interior temperature dropped to 31 degrees, 1 degree below freezing. The stove was running on a combination of split oak and dried corn stalks. Clara fed it every hour through the night. The insulated walls slowed the heat loss enough that the stove's modest output kept pace. Without the cornhusk fill, given the temperature differential outside around 80 degrees between inside and out at the worst hours, the heat loss rate through those thin pine boards would have outpaced what the small stove could produce. The calculation is not complicated. At -45 outside and 68 degrees inside, a wall with R2 effective value loses heat roughly 4 times faster than a wall with R9. A stove that can maintain 68 against a 20-degree night cannot maintain 30 against a -40 night using that same wall. What the cornhusk fill had done, in practical terms, was keep the thermal demand within what she could supply. She burned 3/4 of a cord that night. Without the insulated walls, she would have needed 2 cords and still lost. The morning after the worst night, January 8th, Clara dug out the front door from a 3-foot drift and checked on the animals. The sky was still iron grey, but the wind had dropped. The thermometer outside the cabin door read -21, still dangerous, but survivable. She went to check on her nearest neighbour, a widow named Fanny Holst, who lived 2 miles northwest, whose husband had died the previous spring. Fanny had a good sod house, so Clara wasn't panicked, but 2 miles was navigable by first light, and she wanted to be sure. Fanny was fine. Her sod walls had held and her fire had held. They drank coffee together, and Fanny told her about the cattle she'd heard bellowing through the night from the direction of the Crane place. Clara didn't say anything about that. She walked back home 1 3/4 miles of hard-going through drifted snow in -20 air and got back before Hannah woke up. She built the fire back up and made cornmeal porridge, and they ate it warm, which is the specific small pleasure that cold people develop a complete and serious appreciation for. That afternoon, Hollis Crane rode over. He came to the door and took his hat off when Clara opened it. He stood on the doorstep in the cold for a moment, and she could see him working through some calculation, the way a man does when he has been wrong about something and has to decide what to do with that. He said he lost 8 head overnight. He said the inner wall on his south barn had dropped low enough to kill them frost on the inside of the wood, which means the wall temperature dropped below freezing and stayed there. He asked, with a directness that was more honest than anything he'd said to her before, what exactly she had done to those walls, and whether she thought the same thing could work in a barn. She told him. Not briefly, she walked him through it. The cavity size, the method of filling from the top, the way the husk settled, the difference she'd noticed in fuel consumption. She told him about the floor bags. She told him that it wasn't about the weight of the material, as he'd argued before, but about the air the material trapped, and why still air didn't move heat the way moving air did. Crane listened. He was not, Clara wrote later, a man who apologized in words. But he stayed for almost an hour, asking specific questions, and when he left he said he intended to finish that outer barn wall before next winter, and he'd be doing it differently than he'd planned. There's a harder question under all of this that deserves real attention. Why did people laugh? When Eric Lindquist told the settlement about the Cornhusk walls, and when Vaclav Pohorny offered the charity cord of hickory, and when Hollis Crane said she couldn't stop cold with something you could crumple up, these weren't stupid men. They were experienced frontier farmers who had survived multiple Iowa winters. Their skepticism had a logical basis. The dominant theory of insulation in 1885, to the extent that ordinary settlers had one, was a material theory. Dense things insulated, thick things insulated. Clay, sod, packed earth, these held warmth because they had mass and substance. A sod house worked because 2 feet of compacted earth and grass, dried to something close to brick hardness, was too thick and heavy for cold to penetrate quickly. Log cabins worked when logs were thick. Barn walls worked when they were packed with clay daub. In that framework, cornhusk was a joke. It weighed almost nothing. You could compress an armful of it into a fistful. How was a substance that barely existed going to stop 40 below? The answer, which required understanding convection, conduction, and the specific mechanism by which fibrous materials interrupt heat flow, was not intuitive. It ran counter to what experience seemed to show. Clay felt cold-proof because it felt solid. Husk felt flimsy because it felt insubstantial. The fact that the mechanism of insulation was about trapped air, not material density, was not a thing that everyday observation revealed. Clara had gotten to it not through theory, but through what she saw and felt and measured in fuel consumption. She had empirical evidence before she had any explanation for it. That's actually the more honest way to arrive at a physical truth, and it was more reliable than Crane's experience-based theory because her evidence was recent and specific, where his was general and untested against this particular problem. After that winter, Clara filed her 5-year prove-up papers with the Adair County Land Office in the spring of 1887. The paperwork required documenting improvements to the land: the cabin, the barn, the root cellar, acreage broken and planted. The land agent who took her statement noted the corn crib and 62 broken acres and said the claim was in order. He asked about the cabin modifications and she told him. He wrote "Wall Improvements Insulation" on the form, which was not a standard category at the time. She received her land patent, 160 acres of southwestern Iowa prairie, clear title in her name, alone on July 14, 1887. Clara Bauer, head of household, age 33. She was one of somewhere between 4 and 12% of women who filed independent homestead claims in Iowa, a figure that was growing year by year as more widows and unmarried women found the Homestead Act's language explicit enough to protect them. Single women over 21, widows, deserted wives, all were explicitly eligible under the 1862 Act, which had been drafted with a deliberate, if not entirely principled intent to populate the frontier with as many settlers as possible, regardless of sex. Hannah Bauer started school in Greenfield in the fall of 1887. Clara hired Eric Lindqvist on a permanent basis and broke another 20 acres the following spring. She built a second room onto the cabin in 1888 and insulated that one from the start, husk fill, in the new cavity walls, a better floor system, a second stove. Hollis Crane finished his outer barn wall before the winter of 1886-87 and lost no cattle that year, though the big die-up of 1886-87 killed an estimated 362,000 cattle in Montana Territory and wiped out ranchers from Dakota to Texas. Iowa cattle losses that winter were significant but not catastrophic for farms that had adequate shelter. Vaclav Pahorly told several people that spring that he'd been thinking about what Clara Bauer had done with those walls. He did not say he'd been wrong, exactly, but he started asking questions about what other harvest waste might work the same way. And people noticed that the following fall he was telling customers at the feed mill that husks were worth keeping, not burning. Let's return to the physics one more time, because what Clara had discovered was not just a trick with corn husks. She had solved a problem that building scientists would spend most of the 20th century trying to standardize and codify. A thermal bridge is any path through a wall where heat moves faster than it does through the insulated sections. In Clara's original timber frame cabin, the empty cavity was a thermal bridge convection circulated cold air through it, pulling warmth out faster than solid insulation would have allowed. But there was another bridge that was equally important, the wood framing itself. Wood conducts heat across the grain at roughly R1, 0 to R1, 4 per inch for a typical softwood. That sounds decent until you compare it to insulation. A 3-inch air gap with still air would theoretically give you around R11. But the wood studs and sill plates framing that gap give you R2 to R4 for the same 3 inches. Every vertical stud is a path of reduced resistance running from outside to inside, pulling heat out of the room at a faster rate than the fill between studs allows. This is why, even in a well-insulated wall, the locations of the studs are sometimes visible in infrared photography, slightly cooler on the interior, slightly warmer on the exterior, tracing the path of faster heat loss through the solid wood. What Clara's husk fill did was bring the insulated cavities up to a performance level high enough that the difference between the studs and the fill became less critical. When the cavity is essentially empty near zero insulation, the studs are actually better than the cavity. Fill the cavity to R9, and now the studs are the weak link, but the overall wall performance is dramatically improved. The practical result? Fuel consumption drops, interior temperatures hold higher, and the same fire that couldn't heat a leaky cabin can now heat an insulated one. This principle, eliminating thermal bridges by raising the performance of the surrounding material, is now called thermal bridge elimination, or continuous insulation. It's why modern builders wrap the entire exterior of a house in rigid foam before applying siding, creating a continuous layer of insulation that interrupts every stud path simultaneously. The woman stuffing corn husks into a prairie cabin in 1885 was solving the same problem as the building scientists who codified the solution a century later. There is one more thing worth knowing about the winter of 1886 and the cabin on John Bauer's claim. In February of 1887, roughly 14 months after the Big Freeze, Clara received a letter from her sister in Ohio, who had seen a notice in a farm journal about methods of improving rural cabin insulation. The Iowa Homestead and Western Farm Journal, published in Des Moines, had run a short item noting that some settlers had begun filling cabin wall cavities with various agricultural byproducts including sawdust, straw chaff, and corn husk. The item included no names, but it was enough for her sister to recognize what Clara had described in her letters, and she wrote to ask if it had worked. Clara's reply, excerpted in a letter that her granddaughter donated to the Adair County Historical Society in 1941, was brief. It worked. I still have the land, the claim, the 160 acres that in 1882 had been a German immigrant's dream, and in November of 1885 had been a widow's impossible situation, and in July of 1887 was a woman's legal property. Clear title, no one else's name on the deed. The Cornhusks did not save her from grief. They did not bring John back, or make the November of 1885 less brutal than it was. What they did was keep the temperature in the cabin above freezing on the coldest night of the year, reduce fuel consumption enough that the wood held through January, and buy her the time to get to spring. Spring was all she needed. From spring you could do anything: plant, harvest, file papers, hire help, break more ground. The Cornhusks bought her spring. Spring gave her everything else. What Clara Bauer discovered in 1885 was not unique to her. It was a version of what building traditions around the world had understood for centuries, arrived at from different starting points. Iroquois longhouse builders in what is now upstate New York lined sleeping platforms with woven cornhusk mats, a tradition documented by the New York State Museum, because the mat plus air layer between a person and cold wood or ground reduced heat loss from the body during sleep. Not insulation in the wall sense, but the same physics. Trapped air between body and cold surface, slowing the movement of warmth away from where warmth was needed. In northern Wisconsin and Minnesota, early Scandinavian and Canadian immigrants built cordwood or stack wall houses. Walls made from short log rounds laid crosswise, end grain facing out, with mortar between them. The first known example in the United States stood in Walworth County, Wisconsin, built in 1848 from 14-inch log sections, documented by Reverend Paul B. Jenkins, before it was demolished in 1950. In Decorah, Iowa, roughly 250 miles north of Clara's claim, the Norris Miller House, built in 1856 from split oak in ash and lime mortar, stood well enough to be listed on the National Register of Historic Places in 1976. The critical discovery in cordwood construction, worked out by trial and error over decades, was that you couldn't run mortar all the way through the wall. A solid mortar joint conducts heat at roughly R0 20 per inch. A 1/6-inch mortar joint is R3 2, barely better than a single-pane window. The builders who figured this out, and it took some of them a bad winter or two to figure it out, split the mortar into two separate beads, interior and exterior, with a cavity between them. That cavity was filled with sawdust and lime, or chopped organic material, or whatever insulating fill was available. The same logic Clara had applied to an air cavity in a pine-board wall. Rob Roy, who built and studied cordwood houses in upstate New York for 4 decades, eventually had the University of Manitoba test a 2-4-inch cordwood wall in 2004-2005. The measured R value was R35. A 1/6-inch wall with sawdust lime fill consistently tests at R20 to R24. The fill material, the stuff that was filling the cavity, the stuff that barely existed by the standard of dense thermal mass, was doing the real work. The principle is the same, whether the wall is a 19th century Iowa timber frame packed with cornhusk by a widow solving a fuel problem, or a 1848 Wisconsin cordwood house built from Canadian immigrant technique, or a 2005 university test building in Manitoba. Fibrous materials trap still air. Still air barely moves heat. Walls full of still air stay warm. Modern passive house construction, a building standard developed in Germany in the 1990s and now used on every continent, including tens of thousands of buildings in the United States, is built on one central principle: dramatically reduce heat loss through walls, roofs, and floors, so that the building requires almost no active heating or cooling. A certified passive house uses roughly 90% less heating energy than a conventional building of the same size. The way Passive House achieves this is the same way Clara achieved it in her cabin in southwestern Iowa in the winter of 1885. Fill wall cavities with materials that trap still air. Eliminate thermal bridges by wrapping the structure in continuous insulation. The specific materials are different. Modern builders use mineral wool, blown cellulose, rigid polyisocyanurate foam. The physics is identical. Clara's cornhusk fill, by the measurements available today, was performing at somewhere between R3 and R4 per inch, competitive with modern blown-in cellulose insulation. Better than loose straw, far better than the empty cavity it replaced. Her floor bags of husks under the rugs were performing a function equivalent to modern subfloor insulation. She was not a building scientist. She was a widow with $11, a 7-year-old daughter, 60 acres of standing corn, and a dead man's unfinished cabin that was going to kill them both if she didn't fix it before January. She used what she had. The warmth she kept in that cabin was not metaphorical. It was not about determination or willpower or any of the things people tend to say about women who survived things they weren't supposed to survive. It was about dead air, trapped in cornhusk fiber, conducting heat at 0.038 watts per meter-kelvin, keeping the differential between inside and outside small enough that the stove could hold the line. The physics was always there, waiting to be used. Clara used it. The cornhusks are still there in that principle if you go looking.